willing to be guided by evidence in the practice and policy of counterterrorism. But hey, hope springs eternal, right? So we'll see. I've got three main goals for the next 42 minutes. What are we talking about? It's probably a good place to start. What do we know about it, which is where I really want to sort of focus my time. And then finally, what can we do about it? My background is as an applied psychologist, applied forensic psychologist more specifically. So I was sort of raised on the philosophy of if you're going to do psychology, do it so that you can give it away. Give it away, figure out ways to get psychology into the hands of people who can use it for good in the world. So the last 10 years of my research, where I've really 10 to 15 years, in fact, where I've benefited so much from being around practitioners, people who work on counterterrorism at various levels. I think it has made me a better researcher. It has sensitized me to the need for us to be able to figure out how to translate academic work into things that can be used to make a difference in the real world. So we'll talk more about that as we go. So let's start with the definition. I promise you folks, we could be here all day and night just talking about what is terrorism, but here's what I'll say about it by way of an introduction. This is a fairly common and uncontroversial definition of terrorism. So it's the use or the threat of use of violence by non-state actors, primarily directed against civilians, in pursuit of some social, religious, political, or other ideological goal. One of the typical responses to a definition like this, and certainly whenever I give presentations on terrorism, is, well, what about the rest of it? What about state actors and governments who do this kind of thing day in and day out? Yeah, isn't that also terrorism? Yes, it is. And we have other language for that. We talk about state terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, war crimes, et cetera. By and large, when people use the word terrorism, it tends to be synonymous with non-state actors, and that's my domain. That's what I study. But again, we're talking about violence by non-state actors directed against civilians. In the first instance, there's a bigger, broader target, which is to influence some a government agenda or some social agenda. But if there is no ideology connected to the act or associated with the act of violence, it cannot be terrorism. It's something else. It might look like terrorism. It might certainly feel like terrorism. It might even be reported as terrorism, but it is by definition something else. So that definition, which I use, I pride myself on being consistent when I use that definition, means that there's a lot of things that I have to exclude from what I study. So it excludes gangs. I think we can learn obviously an awful lot from the study of gangs, but we're not talking about the same phenomenon here. It excludes nonviolent extremism. It excludes, I would say, although this is changing, it excludes the majority of mass shootings in school and other settings. And it also would exclude big, high-profile, dramatic acts that are designed to get our attention. They are designed to spread fear, but there's no ideology present. A good example of that would be, I'm sure many of you will remember this from a few years back, the mass shooting in Las Vegas in 2017, October of 2017. This guy, perpetrator Stephen Paddock, his ostensible goal seems to have been to kill and injure as many people as he possibly could. I spent a lot of time looking through his internet search histories, and he looked at He looked at beaches. He looked at crowded events for public holidays. He eventually settled on a country music festival, which was being held just below or next to the Mandalay Bay Hotel in Vegas. He is to date responsible for the largest mass shooting, the worst mass shooting in US history. He was described by investigators as pretty unremarkable in the sense that there was nothing that would sort of distinguish him in any way. But after a very extensive investigation, both by the Las Vegas Police Department and buttressed by an investigation by the Behavioral Analysis Unit at the FBI, no ideological influence was found. Therefore, in my book, Paddock is not a terrorist. He's something else. So what do we know about this subject so far? Well, terrorism, the study of terrorism is not in itself a discipline. There's no such, there is a thing called terrorism studies, but it's more of an area studies type of endeavor. It is a subject that has been touched by just about every academic discipline you can imagine. Some are better represented than others. I will say that political science is probably the most well represented. Psychology, I am biased obviously, but psychology is conspicuous by how relatively absent it has been from serious analyses of terrorism and of terrorist behavior. No one discipline has a monopoly over the study of terrorism, despite, like I said, political science tending to be the most widely associated with it. And typically, you will, if you spend any amount of time at all looking at research on terrorism, you'll see that it tends to be fairly. I'm not trying to draw a satanic cross here or anything. It tends to be fairly interdisciplinary. So you'll see psychologists working with criminologists, working with public health folks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because it is a complex phenomenon, and woebetide trying to understand it, let alone respond to it through the lens of any one discipline alone. But all of that said, for reasons I don't quite understand, quite frankly, psychology has tended to be quite shy about embracing this. A few years ago, I had a wonderful opportunity, thanks to the good folks at American Psychologist, to sort of do a special issue, put out this sort of big agenda piece. How naive I was! I thought people would be flocking to us to say, "Yeah, let's do this." I didn't know there could be a psychology terrorism. And I think it pretty much fell on deaf ears. Things are certainly better now than they were 10, 20, even 30 years ago when I started. But we need to do a better job, like especially at the graduate level, to get more and more engagement from psychology. What do we know? So let me start with a couple of sort of big picture, high altitude perspectives on this. And of course, and especially when we come to Q&A, I can drill down into any of this as deeply as you want. So the first thing that I think really needs to be said, although it might seem like common sense, is that the overwhelming majority of people who hold radical views, and I would say even extremist views, will never commit or never engage in an act of violence. I say that, and I tend to start presentations on this, particularly because so much policy at home and abroad is predicated on the assumption that, well, if we can prevent people from having radical views, we can somehow stem the tide of terrorism. And it's just there is no logical. I mean, it seems intuitive, but it is the evidence just doesn't bear this out. And further complicating that is the fact that there's increasing empirical evidence to suggest that even people who engage in terrorist acts aren't always, some are of course, but they aren't always necessarily people who have fully fleshed out political or ideological views. There is no clear profile. Again, I've been doing this research for such a long time now. It seems like a a very, very obvious thing to say, but so much counterterrorism practice has been predicated in the past around the development of typologies and profiles. And it's not to say that they don't exist, but they have absolutely no predictive capacity whatsoever, and so are of very, very, very limited use to anyone. The reality of terrorism today is that we have men, women, children of all ages, and I literally mean all ages, all backgrounds, all ethnicities, religious creeds, etc., becoming involved in terrorism in all different kinds of ways. They have very different and individual idiosyncratic experiences, and they themselves are changed as a result of that involvement, however it looks like. One very stable trend that we have seen in terrorism over the last 10 years, and it is, I think, really challenges to rethink some of our core assumptions, is that we are seeing more and more and more young people getting involved than ever before. I think, young people have always been involved in terrorism, but they've typically been on the fringes of things via youth movements and non-violent youth auxiliary movements, and then some will sort of eventually migrate into the adult version. Now we're literally seeing adolescents recruiting other adolescents for radicalization and mobilization purposes. It's impossible to talk about terrorism today without seeing just how the internet and social media in particular has completely revolutionized recruitment and mobilization and everything to do with how people get involved in this activity. It also happens gradually. This is not a phenomenon where people snap. I mean, it tends to be a common cliche when it comes to extreme violence generally. We don't see any evidence for it in the terrorism world. And the reality is, in the words of one former terrorist, it's the end result of 1,000 little steps. Just because we don't have access to it, or just because we don't see it, doesn't mean that it isn't gradual. Beware any piece of analysis that tries to boil motivation down to one factor. You are aggression researchers, so I do not have to tell you this. I'm aware that I may be preaching to the choir here, but there tends to be a fairly changeable mixture, or rather, volatile composition, ever-changing, of different things. Big picture issues like ideology and grievances and so forth, that sort of give a sense of urgency and direction and meaning to what people do. But really, those things don't exist in isolation. I mean, everyone has got a story to tell. There are always those private, slightly hidden factors that push and pull people into this world, whether it has to do with the fantasy of just being part of something special, having a mission, a sense of belonging, identity, power, status. Don't overlook the don't overlook the importance of wanting to simply relieve boredom. So many, and we try to do as much detailed ideographic work as we can in this space, because you'll only get so far by analyzing ideological material or looking at terrorist manifestos. If we are to really understand how and why people get involved in this stuff, we have to meet with them. We have to speak with them. It's easier said than done. But even the most cooperative of terrorist interviewees or former terrorist interviewees tend to present with a variety of different factors, all sort of competing with each other for dominance. But very often, quite frankly, it's a story of people being at the right place at the right time, at the right moment in their lives, and just going along with the process. That's not to say that terrorist actors don't have a lot in common. They do have, at a minimum, these 4 key themes. They are outraged at some injustice. There is a profound sense of moral outrage that some injustice has happened, whether it is injustice in a sort of a vague, broad ideological sense, or there is a particular community that has been victimized by a more powerful oppressor. Irrespective of what the particular grievance is, the person that we call the terrorist sees this, excuse me, they can't look away from it. They feel injustice. They feel outraged at that injustice, and they want to do something about it. So terrorists, as opposed to the mere radicals, tend to be action-oriented. They will talk a lot about this, but they are not satisfied with merely talking. At some point, they come to believe or come to accept that violence is the only appropriate response as a means of sort of correcting that injustice. And at some point, again, they have to put in the work. So they have to work hard, psychologically speaking, to convey that what they are doing is just, it's righteous, it's necessary, and it's urgent. Now, here's where things can get a little bit tricky. And Tracy, thank you for the shout out for the book that I'm working on right now, The Recruiters. We don't know anything at all. Well, that's not true. We know very, very little about the role of recruiters in all of this. But whenever I hear people tell me, or I see an account where somebody says that they felt that they needed to do something now as opposed to later, it tends to get me to think that this person is not alone. They're not working out these ideas alone on a computer late at night or through some dark corner of the web. There's probably someone on the other end that is giving them a sort of a timeliness to action. In other words, act now as opposed to later, because A, the enemy will have reached their end goal, so it'll be too late, and B, I don't want you to change your mind, so act now rather than later. And finally, of course, a very common theme as well here, and a ubiquitous theme among people who do cross over, is that they believe their actions will help make a better future for themselves and for the people or the community that they claim to represent. I want to very quickly make a distinction between radicalization and mobilization. Those are two words you'll often hear being sort of bandied around in this space. Radicalization typically refers to a change in thinking. So we talk about radicalization of thought. This is really about how and why someone comes to they get exposed to certain views. They try to work through those views. You know, some might resonate, some might not. But it's about a change in thinking. Radicalization, unfortunately, has become a sort of a byword or a buzzword synonymous with going all the way to terrorism. But I think it's rather misleading. But we can see radicalization. We can, it's all around us. And for me, I keep trying to tell my students that a sign of a healthy, functioning democracy is radicalization, because yes, we should be able to express radical thoughts. Mobilization, on the other hand, it's not to say that all radical thoughts are positive, of course, but mobilization is where someone who has radical beliefs or thoughts is willing to act on those thoughts in a way that suggests that violence may be a consideration. But there's a big difference between someone who is starting to express radical ideas versus someone who is beginning to mobilize into action. And in the context of terrorism, I'm talking about, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term pathway to violence. We're talking about things like mobilization indicators. So everything from, just off the top of my head, but last will and testimonies, writing manifestos, working out ideas, leaking intent, acquiring, procuring weapons, training with them, doing research, doing dry runs, choosing targets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a critical difference there. A point I really want to make here before we sort of pivot to, how can we, what, if anything, is actionable from what we know from that research so far. One of the many, many challenging features of terrorism is that it is always changing. And for a researcher to say that has almost become cliche, but it is almost changing. I wonder if there's anyone here on the call. I know there's at least one person, I'm not going to call him out on it, but who of you actually remembers the original Doom from 1993, let alone has played it, let alone has actually finished it and wasted countless hours of my time in college. Back in the day, Doom was an absolutely revolutionary computer game for many reasons. And I say this with pride. I'm a hardcore computer gamer. I could talk about Doom all day long, but one of the reasons it was so revolutionary, I mean, apart from the violence, which looks sort of crude by today's standards, Doom was one of the very first popular video games to allow users, allow players, gamers to have a sense of immersion, because here was one of the first fully realized 3D environments where someone could walk through this with this weapon, shoot demons, etc., and feel like they were actually part of this environment. Flash forward many years. I've come up with 2019 for a particular reason here. It's not that I haven't updated this slide since 2019, believe you me. Video games today are a multi-billion-dollar industry that have long surpassed the motion picture and film industry. The Call of Duty series, to which I've given far too much of my disposable income, represent pretty much the pinnacle of photorealistic graphics, and of course the level of violence associated with these games has risen concomitantly. This is not from a video game, although it was designed to look like one. And I'm not going to show, this is a still from a video taken in 2019. I'm not going to show you this for obvious reasons. But it was taken by an Australian white nationalist who went to Christchurch, New Zealand to kill as many Muslims as he could possibly get his hands on. The offender was Brenton Tarrant. He live streamed this attack, and his video has since become notorious all over the world. This was his last post before he entered the mosques to target his victims. You see that the very first. I should say that Tarrant himself was an avid gamer, and what he is basically saying to his fellow travelers is, I'm about to do this. If you decide you want to rewatch it again, or you propagate it and you send it out to other fellow travelers, here's some suggestions for music that you could use to accompany the live stream massacre. And some of the themes were from, some of the musical themes were from other video games. But I want to draw your attention to the very first comment that Tarrant got just before he went into the mosque, and the first mosque, and it was, "Get the high score." You will hear researchers today refer to the gamification of terrorism. Brian Jenkins, the famous terrorism expert who worked at the Rand Corporation, used to say for years and years, he would say, terrorism is really fundamentally about publicity. They want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. Well, I think obviously 9/11 changed forever the way we thought about that, because after that it appeared that terrorists wanted both. They wanted a lot of people watching and a lot of people dead. The gamification of terror, and this is a dynamic, by the way, that has now entered into a wider variety of types of extreme violence. We see the same dynamic being played out in non-ideological mass shootings like school shootings, but it's a very common trend. Some people online who were both avid gamers as well as members of the extreme right, or at least sympathetic to the extreme right, have immortalized Tarrant's videos. Some have overlaid the video with the original heads-up display from the or slightly modified from the Doom game, to make it a bit more accessible and perhaps palatable to a younger audience. Some overlaid the Minecraft heads-up display onto that. There are now multiple standalone video games where you can adopt the persona of Tarrant and again engage in a first-person or a third-person video game perspective where you essentially relive the massacres, and this is just one of several games widely available. Tarrant, so that was 2019, and Tarrant, like I said, was an Australian white nationalist, but his words have had his words, and more to the point, his video and the style of his video have had a profound impact among young people all over the world, and particularly in the United States. This young man, Patrick Crusius, was responsible for a mass shooting in El Paso, Texas. Later in 2019, he killed 23 people. His 4-page manifesto began with, "I support the Christchurch shooter and his manifesto." And he says, typical response, "This attack is a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas. They are the instigators, not me. Terrorists will frequently portray their actions as defensive." In other words, I am being forced into this position. They are bringing it on, not me. And he finishes with, my motives through this attack are not at all personal." Tarrant's attack and the style of his attack also were very influential in radicalizing and mobilizing another adolescent, this time Peyton Gendron, in Buffalo, New York, in 2022. There are others. June 2023, this person from Michigan was planning a massacre of a synagogue in East Lansing, Michigan, that would commemorate the 5th anniversary of the Christchurch massacre. I managed to get his Instagram account, and he talked about, again, another dynamic we see. We typically see this in the context of school shooters, but we see it increasingly now in the ideological or the terrorist space as well, where it's not just about emulating a previous attacker or a previous group. It's also about distinguishing oneself by either, again, quote, getting the high score or doing something slightly different. So again, he's saying to his confidant online, "All I know is it's not just going to be a copy of Brenton's, maybe some stuff, but I got to make it unique." And again, this is a very, very common dynamic now. So folks, I could talk to you about these examples all day long, but what's the point? A couple of things. So I think the first thing that warrants acknowledging is that the barriers and boundaries of yesterday are just non-existent. I was recently invited to give a talk on international terrorism to a domestic law enforcement audience here in the United States. And I was curious about why the organizers wanted me to talk about the international side of things. And it was, well, they're not really interested in the domestic side, and they just want to focus on the international part of this. And I said, well, I can do that, but that's a rather silly exercise, because domestic actors are being radicalized and mobilized by international sources of messaging and international sources of inspiration. I mean, these boundaries just don't exist anymore. It might be attractive to have these categories in an administrative sense, but that is yesterday's thinking. This just does not exist anymore. The online world has broken these barriers down to the point where it is now so easy to have real-time influence, such that if you are unlucky either to see these events unfold in real time, or you are unwitting or foolish enough to look at video replays of these, you will become a virtual, I talked about in the recent book, a sort of a virtual pseudo participant in these events. So this is how today's terrorists are using new forms of media to reach audiences that they once couldn't have even dreamed of. But that online world has also meant that there's so many more opportunities for people to to learn about the stuff and to get involved. And like I said, it's not just about the ideology. And we're not talking about some, kids today reading some obscure tract or some obscure book that someone in Pakistan or Afghanistan or Australia or wherever has written. It's the style. The sort of um, the word I'm looking for. It's the signature, I guess. That's sort of the aesthetic. That's the word I've been trying to find. Sorry. It's the aesthetic that is resonating with people, and that very often is the hook that pulls people in to make them want to do a little bit more research on who these people are. Lots and lots of other things changing. Too much for us to cover in the time that we have. I have about 10 minutes left before we'll open up for a bit of a chat. But in the past, it wasn't that difficult to make sense of terrorism. And in the past, I'm talking about 70s to 90s. The so-called terrorist profile was also fairly predictable. I mean, there were always exceptions, of course, but we're mostly talking about young, angry, alienated males, 18 to 24. Typically, that's when people would show up in cases where there would be arrests or otherwise they would be killed. And with some exceptions, women's roles were largely peripheral, and with exceptions, children's roles were almost always peripheral. Now that has all completely changed. Like I said earlier, we're talking about men, women, children, all ages, all backgrounds, all finding their own reasons to get involved, and all with their own expectations of what being involved in one of these movements actually entails. So in a way, I'm probably speaking to the choir here. The word terrorist has become kind of meaningless. It's almost like saying, why someone would become a criminal. People don't join terrorist movements to become terrorists. Some are attracted to the fighting, there's no doubt about it. Some are attracted to the bookkeeping. Some are attracted to the recruiting, the propaganda, spreading videos online, maintaining websites, circulating videos of beheadings. There are lots and lots of ways in which people can find ways to get involved. And it's one of the ultimate ironies, right? That despite the fact that violence is the signature element of what terrorists do, the people who do that in these groups tend to be the 1% of the 1%. There's a whole bunch of roles and jobs and functions available to people in this activity. And not all of it is necessarily illegal too. Now, a couple of years ago, researchers like myself who've been looking at this for probably way too long than is healthy for us, knew that this has been around for a long time. But the FBI, through its director, then director Christopher Wray, drew attention to something he called salad bar ideology. Bit of an odd term, which is unfortunately stuck with us. But the FBI director's point was this. In the past, it wasn't really that difficult to make sense of what terrorists were all about. They tended to be left-wing, they tended to be right-wing, they tended to be jihadists, they tended to be single issue like anti-abortion terrorists or anti-vivisection, animal liberation front type. It wasn't that hard to understand them because you were able to fit them easily into a particular bucket depending on what ideology they espoused. Ray's point was that has all changed. And to a point, I agree. I mean, I think those categories still exist for good reason because we can still fit a lot of actors into those categories. But now we're seeing that, and especially it's coming out through the manifestos of today's attackers, we're seeing terrorist actors pick and choose their own ideologies, and sometimes the content is almost contradictory. So they're taking a little bit of this from this worldview, a little bit of that, and it seems to be just a mishmash of different things in order to suit their own individual grievance. Or perhaps this is how they understand the ideology, but increasingly they are constructing their worldviews on their own and not necessarily relying on something that is prepackaged. I think we're still trying to make sense of that. There's a hell of a lot of terminology out there in the academic world about it. Some call it composite violent extremism. In the UK, they call it mixed, unstable, or unclear ideology. I call it ideological promiscuity. Not trying to be cute with that, but there's a lot of evidence that these offenders are just not feeling the need to remain faithful to one ideology or the other, and they kind of go, well, I don't care if it's contradictory. This particular bit makes sense to me from here, and this particular bit from that makes sense to me here, and I'm going to figure out how to make them talk to each other, and that's that. So all of this, which is a bit of a it's a sort of storm in a teacup, right? Because unless you are up to your tonsils in terrorism research, you're probably not even going to be aware of this. But this is a big debate for us right now because we're trying to figure out what this even means, let alone what to call it. I am not convinced, by the way, that all of the researchers, myself included, are necessarily talking about the same thing through all of these different terms. The National Counterterrorism Center, tried to bring some order to this, and I applaud them for that. They made a distinction between what they call ideology mixers, which is what they said, people who embrace, I'm going to read this, multiple, sometimes contradictory ideologies that they perceive address personal grievances and justify violence. Embedded in that is something we're also seeing more and more. So I think, the way we think most of this tends to work is that someone is, whether they seek it out or it's just, happenstance, they are exposed to a certain ideology. It resonates with them. They then have an opportunity to get involved with the movement. And that ideology, that understanding of that ideology shapes them, gives them a sense of urgency, and it ultimately contributes to them going down the road to a violent act. It's ultimately the movement that decides what's going to happen, where and when, but the person is ready for it. What we're seeing more and more is that people are deciding they want to commit an act of extreme violence. And then they start looking for an ideology or a worldview or multiple ideologies to wrap around it. And folks, we absolutely do not understand what's going on there, and we urgently need to try to figure that out. And the other category here, which is ideology hoppers, which is basically someone going, well, you know what? I've tried right wing, now I'm going to go left wing, or I've tried jihadist, and now I'm going to, move to whatever the opposite of jihadist is. All right, I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to briefly move on to, well, what can we actually do about it? And it's only relatively recently that researchers have started to look at the practical implications of some of this work. And ironically, one of the great ironies here is that some of the most exciting practical developments when it comes to terrorism prevention have come about or have come to light when we decided to stop obsessing with our preoccupation on who are the terrorists, what are they like. Okay, there's no profile, but maybe there's something profile-like. They have to have some things in common. Let's keep digging down. When we actually started to broaden the lens somewhat to the friends, the families, the co-workers, the social circles in which these people move. So when we shift perspective only from looking at the offender to the offender's behavior and the context in which the offender behaves, all kinds of other things start to come to light. And again, for anyone who's familiar with criminology, this is hardly new. I've always considered myself as sort of like a frustrated criminologist, also a frustrated historian, anthropologist, but criminology in particular, because routine activity, rational choice theory was sort of something that I really kind of glommed onto in my grad student days. So this was not This is not new at all. A study that I was very proud to be involved in a while back with my colleagues Paul Gill and Paige Deckert. We were given some funding from the Department of Homeland Security to look more closely at lone actors, the so-called lone wolves, although I hate that term. And what we found was that, again, no profile. That wasn't really surprising at all. But what we did find was really quite stunning. Approximately 2/3 of offenders told their friends and family and coworkers about their intent to commit violence. I'm not talking about, sharing a grievance. I'm not talking about, saying, oh, I hate the government and somebody should do something, or look at the way the country's going. I'm talking about the specific leakage of intent to commit an act of mass violence. A year or two later, after we published our study, our colleagues at the FBI replicated this with closed source data, and they found an even higher percentage. When we look at non-ideological mass violence like school shootings, the U.S. Secret Service found that 100%, and it's a staggering statistic, of school shooters exhibited concerning behavior prior to an attack, and 94% shared their intention with others. So you've all heard the slogan, if you see something, say something. All of this research has been pointing to, in recent years, an abundance of evidence for there being a very pronounced bystander effect. And some of the findings from the Secret Service's research and others is really, really quite stunning. I'm increasingly doing research in the school shooter space, obviously still doing research on terrorism, but it has now brought me into the school shooter world through the bystander intervention work that we've done. One school alone, 39 school friends of one school shooter knew about the attack, but nobody told an adult. People keep saying, well, can we do a better job of detecting manifestos? Yes, we can, but manifestos tend to be posted online on average an hour and 20 minutes before an attack takes place. Why don't people report concerns? I'm going to have to stop within 60 seconds because I really want to be respectful of your time. But what the research tells us so far from research on bystanders in the terrorism space is that it's the friends, it's not family members, it's not teachers per se, it's friends and peers that are the best detectors of the change we're talking about here. What we're also finding out from focus groups and surveys is that friends are saying they want to report, but they are unlikely to because of mostly because of fear. These are the kinds of reports or the kinds of responses we're getting in some of the research that we've done thus far. Is it serious? Maybe they're not really, serious about it. Where do I go? Even if I do want to report, am I calling 911? Am I calling the FBI? Will they get into trouble? Will they know that I reported them? Will I get into trouble? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just, this is just tip of the iceberg, folks here. But I really wanted to highlight this work in particular because it highlights the practical, actionable knowledge that can come from this research if only we are willing to tweak our perspectives ever so slightly. So I will stop there. Here's my email address. Please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything more you want to know or any collaboration or chats you want to have. And always happy to talk terrorism, especially if it gets me away from the current news cycle. So thank you so much. I know that was a fire hose of information, but I will